I grew up in a house that looked perfect from the outside. White walls, polished floors, the smell of fresh flowers in the living room. My mother smiling at visitors with a perfectly poised grace. But behind closed doors, it was a different world. My mother had a talent for making you feel invisible. And my brother, my older brother, he was everything I wasn't. Charismatic, confident, favored in every way. He could do no wrong in her eyes. I, on the other hand, was constantly reminded of my shortcomings. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" she would ask, her tone calm but cutting. And I would swallow my frustration, my tears, my anger. I learned early that survival in this house meant staying quiet, watching, and waiting. I remember the first time I truly felt betrayed by my own family. I was 12, and I had spent months preparing for a school science fair. It wasn't just any project. I had poured every ounce of my curiosity and creativity into it. I had imagined the look on my mother's face, the pride in my father's eyes. When I presented my project, though, my excitement was met with a dismissive glance. "It's nice, dear, but your brother could have done better." The words hit me like a knife. My brother, who had barely lifted a finger, smiled politely, leaned in, and whispered, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it for you." He took credit. He won the prize, and everyone, including my mother, praised him as if he had created it from nothing. I felt invisible, unheard, and powerless, all in one devastating moment. From that day forward, I promised myself I would never be powerless again. As I grew older, I realized the key to surviving and one day thriving in this family was observation. I started noticing patterns. Who favored whom? How my brother manipulated situations. How my mother's praise could be bought with a smile and a calculated compliment. And how my father, ever passive, preferred peace over confrontation. Every argument, every whispered conversation, every subtle look became a lesson. I started keeping mental notes, quietly recording incidents in my mind, filing away proof for the future. The world is cruel, but your family can be even crueler. I would remind myself, and in those moments, I was no longer just a little girl who cried alone in her room. I was learning, planning, and waiting. To survive, I wore a mask. I smiled when praised, hid my tears when criticized, and played the part of the obedient daughter. No one suspected that behind my calm exterior, a storm was quietly brewing. At school, I learned to be independent. I excelled quietly, never seeking attention, but I made friends carefully, people who could be trusted, who would never betray me the way my own family did. One of those friends, Mia, noticed something about me. "You're not the same," she said one afternoon. "There's fire in your eyes now." I didn't reply, but inside, I felt a small thrill. Fire? Yes, fire was the perfect word. I was no longer just surviving. I was preparing. It wasn't just about emotional revenge anymore. It was about strategy. I started paying attention to my brother's weaknesses, my mother's insecurities, and my father's blind spots. Every mistake they made, every lie they told, every betrayal I endured. I remembered. I documented it all in my mind like a ledger of justice. Even small victories mattered. A subtle correction here, a quiet exposure there. I learned to manipulate situations subtly, to plant seeds of doubt, to test their reactions. And as I did, I felt a new sense of control, an intoxicating feeling that maybe, just maybe, I could turn the tables one day. By the time I reached my late teens, I wasn't just the quiet girl who cried at the kitchen table. I was someone who had seen everything, remembered everything, and started planning everything. The family that had underestimated me, dismissed me, and hurt me would soon discover that the most dangerous person in the room is the one they never see coming. And I was coming. By the time I entered college, I had perfected the art of blending in while observing everything. I smiled, laughed, and made friends like everyone else. But my mind never stopped working. I noticed the patterns in people, the things they said but didn't mean, the secrets they tried to hide. And more importantly, I noticed my family's patterns, the ways they manipulated, lied, and underestimated me. Mia became my confidant. She didn't know the full extent of my plans, but she knew enough to keep me grounded. "You're changing," she said one evening, leaning against the dorm balcony railing. "There's a fire in you, but don't let it consume you." I smiled faintly. She didn't understand yet. She didn't see how careful, patient, and precise I had become. Revenge, I knew, was not about rushing. It was about timing. I began documenting everything. Every lie my brother told. Every favoritism my mother displayed. Every misstep my father made. I saved messages, took discreet photos, and memorized conversations. What most people would have dismissed as trivial or insignificant, I filed away in my mind like pieces of a puzzle. The picture was becoming clearer. I knew exactly where my family's vulnerabilities lay, and I knew I could use them. It started with small, subtle acts. I would point out inconsistencies in my brother's stories in casual conversation, leaving him off balance without him realizing why. I would hint to acquaintances about my mother's selective praise, planting tiny seeds of doubt. And I started testing boundaries, how far I could push, without alerting them that I was aware of their manipulations. The thrill of it became addictive. For so long, I had felt powerless, invisible. But now, even the smallest victories gave me a sense of control I had never known. I felt alive in a way I hadn't before. Then one evening, everything changed. I was at a cafe with Mia, casually scrolling through my phone, when I stumbled upon a conversation my brother had sent to a friend, something he thought was private, something that could ruin someone if exposed. His arrogance had blinded him. He had left a trail, and I had found it. I felt my pulse quicken. This was the opportunity I had been waiting for. Not the confrontation itself, but the leverage, the chance to prove, in one precise move, that I was no longer the powerless girl who cried at the dinner table. I didn't act immediately. Patience was everything. I continued to observe, to gather, to plan. Every detail mattered. Over the next few weeks, I started sowing subtle tension in the family. I questioned my mother quietly about inconsistencies in her stories, hinting at her favoritism. I laughed softly when my brother boasted, letting him think his words were meaningless. Behind my calm exterior, I was preparing the perfect storm. It was intoxicating. The feeling of control, the knowledge that one day, all the deception and betrayal would be laid bare, and I would be the one standing in the middle, unshaken, untouchable, and slowly, I began to realize that revenge was not just about punishment. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming my life, my confidence, and my worth. I had waited so long to be seen, and now, finally, I was ready to ensure that the world and my family could not ignore me ever again. The plan was forming step by step. The pieces were in place, and I was ready to begin the first moves in a game my family didn't even know they were playing. By the time I was nearing the end of college, I had become almost invisible in the ways that mattered, and terrifyingly present in ways they couldn't detect. My family still believed I was the quiet, timid girl who could be ignored. They had no idea that I had been quietly observing every conversation, every interaction, every slip of the tongue. It began with small things, a misremembered story here, a casually mentioned truth there, enough to make my brother second-guess his own words. He started to stumble when recounting events, small cracks appearing in the armor he had always relied on. My mother, ever proud and meticulous, began to notice inconsistencies, little glances and hushed questions directed at me, but never enough to pin anything down. And my father, he remained blissfully unaware, a spectator to the game that was unfolding around him. The first victory came almost by accident. My brother had arranged to borrow money from a friend under false pretenses, claiming he needed it for an important project. I happened to overhear the conversation and, without saying a word, discreetly left a note with proof that contradicted his claim where he couldn't avoid it. The next day, he was questioned by the friend, forced to explain himself. I watched from a distance, my chest tightening with a mix of adrenaline and satisfaction. It was a small win, but it felt monumental. I began to push further. At family dinners, I would drop subtle hints, carefully worded, about things they had said in private. The way I said them suggested innocence, but the effect was deliberate. My mother would freeze for a moment, searching my face for meaning. My brother would shift uncomfortably, unsure if I knew more than I let on. The tension was intoxicating. I was no longer powerless. I was a shadow in their world, moving unseen, striking precisely where it hurt. And then came the first confrontation. Though indirect, my brother had made another mistake, a careless lie meant to impress a colleague. I knew it could ruin him if exposed at the right moment. I didn't confront him directly. Instead, I let it slip in conversation with a mutual acquaintance, framed as casual gossip. The resulting ripple was immediate. The colleague questioned my brother, and his confident facade began to crumble. I watched as he struggled to maintain control, realizing too late that he had underestimated me. Even my mother began to notice a change. She would watch me with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity, as if sensing that her carefully constructed household was no longer entirely hers to command. But she still underestimated me. She believed that I was still the obedient daughter, the girl who would quietly accept whatever fate she was given. They all did. The thrill of it was undeniable. For so long, I had been invisible, dismissed, even mocked. Now I felt alive in a way I never had before. Each small victory built my confidence, sharpened my mind, and strengthened my resolve. I was learning not just to survive, but to control the narrative, to bend the world around me, piece by piece. Yet, I knew I had to remain patient. Revenge, I had learned, was a slow game. One misstep, one premature revelation, and everything could crumble. So I waited, watched, and calculated. Every conversation, every interaction became a tool, every secret a weapon. And then one evening, as I sat alone in my apartment, reviewing the files and evidence I had quietly collected over months, I realized something. I wasn't just planning revenge anymore. I was crafting a reckoning that my family would never forget. The day finally arrived when all the patience and planning I had invested began to bear fruit. I had been waiting for the perfect opportunity to act, an event where my family would be exposed in the most undeniable way, where my careful manipulations could unfold without interruption. And that opportunity came in the form of my mother's birthday gathering, a lavish affair that would bring every relative, friend, neighbor under one roof. I arrived early, dressed simply but elegantly, projecting the calm confidence I had cultivated over years of observation. My mother, ever the perfectionist, barely noticed me at first, preoccupied with guests and decorations. My brother, as expected, was brimming with his usual arrogance, already rehearsing stories to impress everyone. I let them believe that I was still the quiet, unassuming girl, the one they could dismiss. I smiled, exchanged pleasantries, and kept my head low, all while my mind raced through the final steps of my plan. Every conversation I had over the next hour was a calculated move, every glance a subtle signal. Then, just as the guests were settling in and the champagne glasses were raised, I made my move. My brother had been boasting about a project, claiming credit for something I knew he hadn't earned. I smiled softly, waited for the perfect pause, and spoke, almost casually. Isn't it interesting, though, that the details of that project seem different from the ones you shared last week? A hush fell over the room. My brother's confident smile faltered. My mother froze mid-sentence, sensing that something was off, but unable to immediately identify what. The guest turned toward us, curiosity piqued. I continued, my voice calm but firm. I came across some information recently, emails and messages, that suggest the work presented was not entirely your own. It seems that credit might have been given where it wasn't due. The effect was instantaneous. My brother's face went pale, and he stammered, trying to explain himself. But the evidence I had collected over months of careful observation and planning was damning. My mother's composed mask cracked, revealing shock and disbelief. Even my father, who had always avoided confrontation, seemed speechless, caught in the gravity of the revelation. For the first time in years, I saw them as I had always seen myself, fallible, vulnerable, and exposed. And I realized the full power of patience, observation, and meticulous planning. Every slight, every betrayal, every dismissal had led to this moment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth spoke for itself, and the room absorbed it like a shockwave. Whispers began to circulate among the guests, curious and judgmental, amplifying the tension. My brother's usual charm, the arrogance that had shielded him for so long, was gone. And just as I had anticipated, my mother's reaction was revealing. She tried to regain control, to defend her favored child, but her words were hollow, unconvincing. I watched as the carefully constructed facade of our family began to crumble, piece by piece, under the weight of truth. I realized then that revenge wasn't just about punishment. It was about reclaiming my power, asserting my presence, and exposing what had been hidden for so long. And in that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. The quiet girl who had been ignored, dismissed, and underestimated had finally arrived. The evening continued, but the dynamics had shifted irreversibly. Guests whispered. My brother muttered defensive excuses, and my mother struggled to maintain her composure. I remained calm, poised, observing every reaction, savoring the subtle but undeniable victory. It wasn't over, of course. There would be fallout, questions, anger, and perhaps even attempts to regain control. But for the first time, I knew without a doubt that the balance had shifted. I had taken the first, decisive step in reclaiming what had always been mine: respect, recognition, and self-worth. As I looked around the room, I realized something profound. Revenge, carefully executed, wasn't about making others suffer. It was about revealing the truth, about asserting yourself, and about walking away with your dignity intact. And for the first time in my life, I felt completely, undeniably, unstoppable. The days that followed were quiet, almost eerily so. The dramatic confrontation at my mother's birthday gathering had shifted everything, though the house itself tried to maintain the illusion of normalcy. My brother avoided my gaze. My mother busied herself with tasks she could no longer control. And my father remained silent, perhaps finally realizing that he had spent years allowing manipulation and favoritism to go unchecked. I, however, felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of invisibility, of being dismissed and overlooked, had been lifted. I wasn't seeking revenge for the sake of malice. I was reclaiming the life and dignity that had been denied to me for so long. Every careful observation, every subtle act, every calculated risk had been leading to this moment. And now I could finally breathe. Mia called me that evening, her voice filled with excitement. I heard everything. That was incredible. You really did it. I smiled, leaning back in my chair, feeling the satisfaction settle deep in my chest. It wasn't just me, I said quietly. It was years of paying attention, of learning, of waiting for the right moment. Timing is everything. As I reflected, I realized the truth about my family and about myself. People who hurt you, who dismiss you, who betray you, they are often the ones who teach you your greatest lessons. I had learned resilience, patience, and the art of understanding human nature. I had discovered that the most powerful weapon in the world isn't anger. It isn't cruelty. It's knowledge, preparation, and self-belief. I walked through the house that evening, passing my mother's meticulously arranged living room and my brother's empty study, and I felt a quiet triumph. The family that had underestimated me, dismissed me, and tried to control me had learned, whether they wanted to or not, that I could no longer be ignored. It was liberating, and as I sat alone in my room, I allowed myself a moment to smile, a small knowing smile. I thought of all the moments that had hurt me, all the times I had been overlooked, and all the times I had doubted myself. None of that mattered now. I had turned the pain into power, the betrayal into strategy, and the silence into a voice they could no longer ignore. Sometimes revenge is misunderstood. It isn't about cruelty. It isn't about inflicting pain for the sake of it. True revenge, true reclamation, is about standing tall in the face of betrayal, reclaiming your dignity, and refusing to be silenced. And in that quiet, triumphant evening, I realized that I had achieved something far greater than I had ever imagined. I had reclaimed myself. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just seen. I was respected. And nothing, not favoritism, not manipulation, not betrayal, could take that away from me. The people who doubted me, who hurt me, and who dismissed me, they taught me everything I needed to know. And now, I am unstoppable. The room was silent, but inside me, there was a quiet celebration. I had survived, I had learned, and I had triumphed, not by force, not by malice, but by patience, intelligence, and unwavering belief in myself. And that, I realized, is the ultimate revenge. Even after the birthday gathering, the tension in the house didn't dissipate. If anything, it grew. My brother avoided me with a careful, almost paranoid precision. Every word I spoke seemed measured against some internal ledger he now kept of my potential to expose him further. My mother, too, began glancing at me in a way that was no longer just critical. It was wary. It was as if she finally understood that the child she had dismissed for years had grown into someone she could no longer control. The most fascinating part, though, was watching my father. He was quiet, reserved, but his silence was telling. For the first time, I sensed he was seeing things with clarity, noticing the cracks he had ignored for years. I didn't need his approval, but it was oddly satisfying to know he could no longer feign ignorance. Life continued around me, but my perspective had shifted. I wasn't just navigating the usual frustrations of family life. I was shaping it, influencing it with precision. Small victories became a game, but one that demanded careful strategy. I continued documenting moments, texts, social media posts, casual remarks, all becoming potential leverage. Each day, I grew more confident in my ability to manipulate the dynamics to my favor, without overtly stepping into confrontation. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that I noticed the first sign of desperation. My brother had started to reach out to people in subtle ways, trying to repair his reputation after the birthday incident. He would drop comments, clarify situations, offer explanations, but it was too little, too late, and it fascinated me how quickly someone who had always been confident could unravel when their power was suddenly questioned. I realized something crucial. Revenge, once begun, doesn't always need to be forceful. Sometimes it's enough to let the natural consequences unfold, to be patient while the people who wronged you stumble on their own. I had given them the spark. Now the fire was spreading on its own. And then came the message that truly delighted me. One of my brother's closest friends, someone he had relied on for years, reached out privately to me. "I'm not sure I can trust him anymore," the message read. A thrill ran through me. This was the ripple effect I had anticipated. My brother's mistakes were no longer contained. They were spreading, touching everyone who had once supported him blindly. I smiled quietly to myself. It wasn't malice that fueled me. It was clarity, precision, and the undeniable satisfaction of finally being in control. Yet I knew the biggest moment was still ahead. Subtle victories were satisfying, yes, but they were preludes to the real reckoning. My mother still held power in her judgment. My brother still had ego to defend. And my father still had the authority of silence. Each could be leveraged. Each could be shifted, but only at the right time. Patience remained the greatest weapon I had. As I reflected on these developments, I realized that the story wasn't just about them. It was about me, about how I had grown from the quiet, overlooked girl into someone capable of navigating complex emotions, manipulating circumstances with subtlety, and ultimately claiming what was rightfully mine. I had learned a vital truth. Revenge isn't just about proving others wrong. It's about transforming yourself, stepping into the power that was always within you, and refusing to let anyone, no matter how close, diminish it again. And as the evening light streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the room, I allowed myself a small, victorious thought. They had underestimated me, and that was their greatest mistake. The weeks that followed brought a strange, uneasy calm to the household. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Family dinners continued. My brother smiled politely at guests, and my mother maintained her facade of control. But underneath, the atmosphere was tense, like a storm hovering just out of sight. Every glance, every word, every hesitation carried weight. I reveled in this subtle power. I didn't need overt confrontation. The cracks were widening on their own. My brother's arrogance had been replaced by cautious calculation. He no longer assumed he could manipulate situations without consequences. Even my mother, meticulous and composed as she was, had started second-guessing herself. I could sense her insecurity growing, the slightest flicker of doubt whenever she addressed me. And yet, the story wasn't finished. Life has a way of introducing unexpected twists, even when you believe you are in full control. One evening, while reviewing my meticulously gathered evidence, I discovered something that made my pulse quicken. My brother had been hiding more than just lies about his projects. There were financial deceptions, favors taken under false pretenses, and manipulations that could have far-reaching consequences if revealed. I realized then that I had underestimated just how deeply his schemes had penetrated our family's life. But rather than panic, I felt exhilaration. This was an opportunity, another lever to shift the balance even further. I smiled to myself, knowing I had the perfect timing to expose everything when it would hurt the most, without ever seeming aggressive or vindictive. The next morning, my brother approached me cautiously. His eyes betrayed his unease, though he attempted his usual charm. "Look, I think maybe we should talk," he said, his voice measured. I nodded slowly, keeping my expression calm. "Of course," I said, masking the satisfaction I felt. He tried to negotiate, offering apologies that sounded rehearsed, explanations that seemed hollow, and even promises of change. But I had long learned that words are cheap. They are only valuable when backed by actions. And the evidence I held was beyond words. Over the next few days, subtle confrontations began to unfold. I let my brother make mistakes, revealed pieces of information strategically, and watched as his confidence eroded. Friends who had once supported him began questioning his integrity. Colleagues who had trusted him hesitated, unsure of his credibility. The ripple effect I had anticipated was growing stronger by the day. My mother's behavior became increasingly erratic. She would scrutinize me with a mixture of suspicion and fear, attempting to control situations, yet failing because she no longer fully understood the dynamics. Every move I made was deliberate, every interaction calculated. I had become a master of patience and subtlety. The ultimate satisfaction, though, was the realization that I was no longer reacting to their actions. I was orchestrating the events, guiding the story toward its climax. I had become the invisible hand shaping the narrative, turning betrayal into empowerment, neglect into strategy. And then came the evening that would cement everything. My brother, desperate to salvage some semblance of his reputation, made a critical error. A careless message, sent to the wrong person, revealed a layer of deception he hadn't intended to expose. I had anticipated this possibility for weeks, and now the opportunity was perfect. I waited, as always, for the precise moment. Timing, I had learned, was everything, and when the moment arrived, I revealed the truth, not with anger, not with malice, but with the quiet, undeniable authority of someone who had spent years observing, planning, and waiting. The effect was instantaneous. My brother's carefully maintained facade shattered. My mother's composure crumbled further, and my father, finally seeing the full picture, seemed to realize the depth of the deception he had ignored for so long. For the first time, I understood the full scope of my power. Revenge was not about cruelty. It was about patience, observation, and understanding. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully yours, and never allowing others to diminish it again. As I sat quietly that night, reflecting on the events, I felt a profound sense of clarity. The family that had once dismissed me, belittled me, and underestimated me had been forced to acknowledge me, not through confrontation alone, but through strategy, timing, and unwavering determination. And in that moment, I realized something even more important. True power is not in inflicting pain. It is in rising above it, in shaping your destiny, and in transforming betrayal into the fuel that drives your own success. They thought they could control me. They thought they could break me. But they were wrong. I am unstoppable. The house had changed. Not outwardly, not in its polished floors or carefully arranged decor, but in the invisible currents that ran beneath the surface. Conversations were guarded, glances measured, and even laughter seemed tempered with caution. My family, once so confident in their control over me, had begun to realize that they were no longer in charge. I moved through this new reality with calm precision. Each interaction was deliberate, each word chosen carefully. My brother had become tentative, unsure of himself in ways I had never seen before. He watched me, measuring, analyzing, trying to anticipate my next move. But I had already anticipated his hesitation. I was always one step ahead. My mother's behavior was even more fascinating. She oscillated between attempts at control and open displays of anxiety. I noticed the subtle ways she sought validation from me now, as if she were testing whether the quiet girl she had dismissed could still be molded. I let her try, answering politely, but never revealing the full extent of my knowledge or intentions. The ripple effect extended beyond the household. Friends, colleagues, and acquaintances who had once taken my brother's side began to question him. Rumors spread, not because I propagated them directly, but because the truth I had exposed had planted seeds that could not be ignored. People who had trusted him blindly now approached me with curiosity, seeking my perspective, subtly acknowledging my presence and intelligence. I had become a force they could not ignore, a presence that reshaped the dynamics around me without overt aggression. And yet I remained patient, knowing that the ultimate test, the true reckoning, was still ahead. It came one evening during a family meeting. ostensibly to discuss household finances. My father had called everyone together, unaware of the tension that would soon surface. I entered the room calmly, carrying myself with the poise of someone who understood their own power. My brother shifted uncomfortably in his seat. My mother's eyes flicked toward me with a mixture of suspicion and apprehension. I spoke softly, almost casually. "I've reviewed the accounts," I said, "and there are several discrepancies that need explanation." Silence fell. My brother's mouth opened, then closed, as he tried to formulate a response. My mother's composure wavered, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Even my father seemed unsettled, unsure of how to react to the quiet authority in my voice. I laid out the evidence I had collected, the financial irregularities, the manipulations, the lies, all presented without accusation, only undeniable proof. The room crackled with tension as my words sank in. My brother's ego, which had once been untouchable, now faltered. He tried to defend himself, but each argument crumbled under the weight of the facts. My mother attempted to intervene, but I had anticipated her moves as well. Every objection she raised was met with calm, reasoned responses that left her with no choice but to concede. And then, the moment of true satisfaction arrived. My father, who had long remained passive, finally spoke. "It seems we have underestimated you," he said quietly, his tone carrying both acknowledgement and regret. I didn't need his approval, but it was satisfying nonetheless. The balance of power in the household had shifted irrevocably. I was no longer the overlooked daughter. I was the one who commanded attention, respect, and most importantly, authority. The evening ended with a quiet understanding among us. My family had been forced to confront their mistakes, their favoritism, and their underestimation of me. I had not humiliated them for the sake of revenge. I had revealed the truth, asserted my presence, and claimed my rightful place. As I left the room that night, I felt a profound sense of clarity. The journey had not been easy, and the battles were far from over. But I had learned the ultimate lesson. True power is not in dominance or cruelty, but in patience, observation, and unwavering self-belief. And as I closed the door behind me, I allowed myself a small victorious smile. They had underestimated me for years, but now they had no choice but to see me for who I truly was. Unstoppable, unshakable, and finally in control of my own destiny. The days that followed the family meeting were charged with a quiet tension that was impossible to ignore. The house felt different. Every glance, every word carried weight. My brother moved through it cautiously, aware now that his arrogance could no longer shield him. My mother's gestures, once confident and commanding, were now tentative, measured, as if she were constantly testing whether I would react. Even my father, who had long remained passive, seemed to regard me with a new understanding, his silence carrying acknowledgement and perhaps a hint of pride. I found a strange satisfaction in the subtle shifts. I didn't need to speak loudly or assert myself aggressively. The power was in the knowledge, the observation, the unseen leverage I held over them all. I had become the axis around which the household now rotated. Quietly, deliberately, and irreversibly. But the fallout wasn't confined to the house. My brother's reputation among friends and colleagues had begun to falter. Rumors, born of truth, spread rapidly. Invitations he had assumed were secure were now rescinded or questioned. People who had once taken his side subtly shifted their attention toward me, not out of malice, but because they recognized the intelligence, poise, and authority I had always possessed, now fully revealed. One evening, my mother confronted me privately. Her voice was soft, almost tentative. "I don't understand how you became like this," she said. "I thought you were fragile. I thought you'd always follow the rules I set." I looked at her calmly, The years of hurt, observation, and careful planning condensed into a single, unwavering gaze. I learned from the very things you thought would break me, I said. Every dismissal, every favoritism, every betrayal, I saw it all, and I turned it into strength, not to hurt you, but to find my place. Her silence spoke volumes. For the first time, she understood that the quiet girl she had dismissed was no longer silent. She had underestimated me for decades, and that had been her greatest mistake. My brother tried to reassert control in small ways, attempting subtle manipulations, testing boundaries, but I was always one step ahead. Every move he made revealed more of his weakness, more of his reliance on deception to maintain power. I didn't need to confront him aggressively. The exposure I had orchestrated, combined with his own missteps, was enough to keep him on the defensive. And through it all, I realized the ultimate truth. Revenge, carefully executed, is not about cruelty. It is about reclaiming your voice, your presence, and your dignity. It is about standing firm while others stumble, about transforming every slight, every betrayal, and every dismissal into fuel for your own rise. By the end of that week, the balance had shifted completely. My family could no longer dismiss me, ignore me, or manipulate me. Every interaction carried the quiet weight of my authority. Every glance reflected their acknowledgement of my presence, and every word revealed their awareness that I was no longer the girl they had once controlled. Sitting alone in my room that night, I reflected on everything that had happened. The betrayals, the manipulations, the long years of being overlooked. None of it had broken me. Instead, it had taught me patience, strategy, and the art of observation. I had learned to turn powerlessness into influence, invisibility into authority, and silence into a force that could not be ignored. And as I looked out the window at the city lights twinkling below, I felt a profound sense of clarity. They had underestimated me for years, but now they had no choice but to see me as I truly was: strong, intelligent, and unstoppable. This is what it feels like to reclaim yourself. This is what it feels like to rise. By the time weeks had passed since the final confrontations, the household had settled into a new rhythm, but it was nothing like the rhythm of the past. The old hierarchies, the favoritism, the assumptions that I would always be the quiet, powerless daughter, they were gone. The dynamics had shifted irrevocably, and everyone in the family knew it. My brother avoided confrontation, but I could see the wariness in his eyes. Every word he spoke was measured, cautious, as though walking on thin ice. My mother, who had once believed she could shape me entirely, now sought my approval in subtle, hesitant ways. Even my father, quiet and passive, acknowledged my presence with a nod, a rare smile, or a moment of silence that carried more weight than words could express. I had achieved what I had set out to do, not through anger, not through rash retaliation, but through patience, intelligence, and unwavering determination. Every slight, every betrayal, every dismissal had been a lesson, a stepping stone, a guidepost to the person I had become. The most powerful moment, though, came quietly. One evening, as I was organizing some old family photos, my mother sat beside me. She didn't speak at first, merely observing. Then she said softly, almost hesitantly, I see you now. I understand what I didn't see before. You are strong. You've changed everything. I smiled gently, feeling a weight lift that I hadn't realized I had been carrying. I had to learn for myself, I replied, and I had to take my place, not to hurt anyone, but to finally be seen. It wasn't revenge in the sense of cruelty or malice. It was justice. It was recognition. It was reclaiming a life, a voice, and a sense of self that had been denied for too long. In the weeks that followed, life continued, but it was different now. I had confidence, clarity, and control. My family had learned that underestimating me had consequences, but more importantly, they had learned to respect the person I had become. And I had learned the most important lesson of all. True empowerment comes not from striking back in anger, but from turning every slight, every betrayal, and every moment of dismissal into the fuel that drives you to rise higher, stronger, and smarter than ever before. I often thought back to the little girl who had cried alone in her room, who had felt invisible, dismissed, and powerless. She would be proud of what I had become. I had transformed pain into strategy, invisibility into authority, and silence into power. And as I looked at my reflection one quiet evening, I allowed myself to smile fully, without hesitation. "I am unstoppable," I whispered. "I have survived. I have learned, and I have risen." The family that had once sought to diminish me had inadvertently shaped me into someone they could no longer ignore. And in that realization, I found not just victory, but liberation. Because in the end, true revenge isn't about hurting others. It's about reclaiming yourself, rising above betrayal, and standing firmly in the person you were always meant to be. And now, I am free. Thanks for watching. Hoped you liked it. If you watched till the end, please comment revenge so that we could understand you were with us till the end. As well as please let us know, where are you watching from? What do you want to hear from us in next video? If you have any incident in your life, please let us know. We would love to share your story.